Content over everything.
In Britain, the government has constantly argued throughout this crisis, right from January, February onwards, that they are following the science. That's been their argument. Following the science. I don't know how many times we heard this argument. We are listening to the science. We are following the science. We're guided by the science. Every single time you turn on television for the government discussions, the government briefings with the so-called press in Britain, you get one lot of bullshit after another from government officials, ministers, and the so-called lead scientific advisors. Chris Whitty, Sir Patrick Vallance, all of them have been responsible for the toll of thousands and thousands of people killed, in fact, by the direct policies as a result of the policies of this British government. The most incompetent British government in living memory. These fools, led by the inspiration of a man called Dominic Cummings. By the way, here, just so you know, this is a poster I put out on the 15th of March. I put this around London. And that was a bit more than a week before they locked down. He said, act now to say, I remember people attacked me for this. So I put one up at Ladbroke Grove. And this woman ran up and tore it down straight away. It says, act now to save lives. Test all with symptoms. Not done to this day in Britain. Now, this was the 15th of March. And yet we're now at the beginning of June. Not done to quarantine close contacts. Not done to this day in Britain. Shut down for 3 weeks. Well, what they called they tried to shut down, pretend to shut down for 3 weeks. In reality, as I said the week before that, on the 8th of March at Speaker's Corner, you can check the videos. What we required was a de facto general strike. And that also, in a way, and that's why I come on to some of the demands and slogans here, because we are living at the moment, not only with the most incompetent government in British history, in living memory, but also with the mad policies they're pursuing, returning to the centre of their ideology, of their strategy, of their plans, or so-called plans to defeat Covid. So now they say to us, the R number, this was last week, is between 0.7 and 0.9. And then I know the modelers, that's what they work on, modelers. In other words, you put a load of numbers in an Excel spreadsheet, and then you work out the dynamics for a virus. On the basis of a spreadsheet, then you add in some added factors. Susceptibility of children, isolation of the old, transportation hub.
Well, where's your target? Because that's a legitimate form of working out the world. Numbers is a legitimate form.
Numbers is a legitimate way of modelling some aspects in normal, easily calculatable circumstances. It was very easy to work out at the beginning of March what the rate of infection and speed of infection and the numbers of dead would be. It was easy to work it out. It was always easy to work it out because other countries had already been through it. Yet when you listen to these, I won't use the words I should use, these creatures who call themselves government experts, who call themselves ministers, who call themselves special advisors, who call themselves the Prime Minister. When you listen to them, they don't listen to what happened in China, or in South Korea, or in Singapore or Hong Kong, or New Zealand. It's instead the British science. Matt Hancock was on television this morning. This bloody morning. 10 weeks on television, and he says, we made the right decisions at the right time. 60,000 dead, according to the FT's investigations. 40,000 dead, according to official figures. Infections hovering between 5,700 and 8,000 every day, new infections. That's the figures they're giving, not mine. They are saying that. Far more than when we locked down on the 23rd of March. So now we're walking on a tightrope, you and I, walking on a tightrope and expected to dance with death. That's what the government wants us to do. That's what the government's saying we must do. And then until this week, they banned us from speaking. But I ask you this, if you can't speak, not just speak at Speaker's Corner, but I made a radio show. I'm a journalist. I made a radio show. I was in discussion with an expert working for the German Interior Ministry on a COVID-19 task force. I tried to send him a message through Facebook, a Facebook Messenger, not public post, Facebook Messenger. As soon as I click send, it comes back and says, community guidelines prevent you from sending this. Community guidelines prevent me from communicating with people. The government stands at the press briefings every day. They say to people, we are guided by the science, the British science. So it's national, first of all. Science is an international knowledge endeavour throughout human history. It's a national phenomenon. And of course, organised what they call the science. It turned out, and now they've published some of the minutes of the SAGE meetings, but the scientific data has not been published. So the question I was asked at the beginning, should we, listen to the science, be informed? The public should know the scientific arguments. Not only the scientific arguments, by the way, because it's not just the scientific question. Dealing with epidemics by quarantine has been a method used for nearly 1,000 years. In Italy, you go around Italy, there are towers, watchtowers, because it was a naval, maritime power. There are watchtowers all around Italy to observe quarantines. Quarantine is 40 days. That's what he means. 40 days because it came from ships. That's why also Diamond Princess and the cruise ships were primary vectors of transmission. Now, Cheltenham Festival, Atletico Madrid versus Liverpool, Boris Johnson shaking hands with everybody, lying in fact, because he didn't shake hands with COVID patients at that time. But never mind, it was a good enough spin to tell the people. What he did say was on the 3rd of February, he made a speech, now it's become quite well known, where he said, you may remember looking at the television broadcast of it, and Johnson, he goes like, he pulled a Churchillian stance, and he goes, we will defend the right of nations to freely trade around the world. This was Boris Johnson. What did he mean? He meant, we will take no measures to prevent the spread of the disease. In fact, we will encourage the spread of the disease. That was government policy. And in fact, in some ways, it's returning to the centre stage because they're saying, economics, we must protect the economy. They have already made millions unemployed in Britain. Millions unemployed. 40 million unemployed in the United States of America. This is not only a crisis of health, it is a crisis of the social system we live under. The people who die from COVID-19, 90% of them, 99% of them have comorbidities, it said. Why is it that some social systems effectively collapsed during the crisis, and others did not. It is because some countries, the United States of America, Great Britain, to some degree Spain and France, and Italy, they had as social systems, they suffering from comorbidities. That's the truth of the matter. The social system is not organized to do anything. When it actually comes to a crisis, they are totally and absolutely paralyzed, incapable of taking action, not only to defend the public, but even to defend themselves. How else? I mean, why should we listen to these people? How do they get the gall to stand in front of us? Chris Whitty, I remember, 5th of March, Health and Social Care Commission. They questioned him about the virus. And Jeremy Hunt was the chair of the meeting. And Hunt said to him, well, how can you catch this disease? He says, can you catch it from shaking hands with someone? He says, the virus doesn't live long on your hands. And then he immediately coughs into his hand, not a tissue. Then they ask, should you wear a mask? I see some people wearing masks now. Should you wear a mask? I've got masks in my pocket. When do I wear a mask? Well, it's up to you when you wear a mask in many ways. But the scientific data, from what I've seen, from Korea, from China, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, and also from international studies, and China's just part of Taiwan. China's just part of Taiwan, sorry. Taiwan's just part of China. Sorry about that.
Guys, clap for our comedian. For the Taiwan joke.
Nice to see you again. I'm glad you're well.
Thank you.
Both mentally and physically. Now, the mask really is a protection in an enclosed environment. I was asked earlier on, the Black Lives Matter demo, and I came down here on Wednesday. There were very large crowds over here, mostly young people. And they were shouting, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, and so on. Now, personally, I would not have gone into the centre of that crowd. Why? Because large numbers of people shouting in a reasonably tight environment does have risks, even in the open air. But let's be clear, when Priti Patel says, don't go on a demonstration, don't forget, they said Atletico Madrid fine. They left the tubes, trains, workplaces open till the 23rd of March. They said everyone should go to the Cheltenham Festival, 250,000 people there. When no one was aware of the virus and how they should protect themselves against the virus, better said. A mask, in my opinion, should be worn only when you enter an enclosed space. Or when you're in a big crowded environment like that, then wear a mask as well. That's what I would say. If you wear a mask when you're walking on the street, I don't think it's rational. Because the virus, and I understand why you're doing it, because the public information campaign by the government has been full of holes, flaws, gaps, and scientific nonsense from day one. Whenever they were asked about masks, and they were asked many times in that sycophantic orgy between the press and the government briefings. They were asked many times. Now, many countries are saying wear masks. What do you think, Minister? Then the Minister would turn around and say, I know I referred to Patrick Vallance. I referred to Chris Whitty. I referred to Jenny, whatever her name is. And then they would turn around and say, well, let's say, if you wear a mask, it doesn't offer you much protection. It doesn't offer you much protection, they said. But of course, the issue all along, not only was your own protection, but was the protection of others. If you have asymptomatic infection, which everybody has until such time as the cough or the fever starts, there's a period of 1 to 2 days when you can transmit without even knowing you're infected. And therefore, if you suddenly start coughing in a supermarket, and the supermarket was the same thing, the staff weren't given masks. The workers on the buses, 10 of them at least, drivers, dropped down dead. Why did they die? Because Sadiq Khan told us in early March there's no danger on the tube, no danger on the buses. He is responsible for the deaths on the tube. Simple as that. Now they turn round like some mad lunatics and they say, from the, I think it's the 15th of March, 15th of June, you should wear a mask when you enter a building. In other words, first, if you know, you have a man and woman meet together, they have sex multiple times. She doesn't want to get pregnant. He doesn't want her to get pregnant. They have sex 50 times in 2 months. And then at the end of that, they go to a doctor and the doctor says, now wear a condom tomorrow. And it will stop you getting infected. This is the idea. Or stop you getting pregnant. This is the madness these people have been doing. And then they present this as fact. Now the Black Lives Matter, the reason Priti Patel goes on about it is because if the numbers go up now again, which it looks like it will, because they haven't stamped out the virus. Britain has more deaths yesterday and the day before than all of the European Union. 27 states, we have more deaths than them. Now it is perfectly true, and I mentioned this right back at the beginning of March, that generally diseases such as this, viruses such as this, will have some seasonality to them. The seasonality, and I wondered about that when Brazil was struck down quite severely. But then if you look, you also see Brazil's flu season is now. And that's why it's spreading, or it's possibly why it's spreading like this. So the summertime, and also the government knew this, the summertime was less likely to be a period of high infection rates. The problem is, once you've already got high numbers of infections, and they're talking, as I said, of between 5,600 and 8,000 per day new infections now, which equals about 50 dead or 80 dead who are now infected today. About 80 of those people will die. Now, I don't know if you remember in the old days, before lockdown, before the global crisis of capitalism, multiplied by the lockdown, multiplied by Covid-19, before all of this happened, you know, you used to have, what was I going to say again? I can't remember. You used to have, I lost my train of thought. Terribly sorry, I lost my train of thought. Happens, too many months locked away. It'll come back to me.
Number of deaths than the other European countries.
Yeah, we have a much higher number of deaths than the other European countries. The problem is, once you've got a large number of infections circulating in the population, you know, then of course the possibility for rising numbers is there inevitably. That's what we saw in Korea. There were 2 clusters in Korea that spiked upwards again, and they contained them. And one was in the church, 3,000 infected. The other was in a call center, about 100 people infected, 200 people infected in a call center, which tells you why the government ideas are wrong. Why? Because it's no good saying you can return to work. Let's say 20 of you work in offices. And when you return to work, the office manager, he said, well, I know what the government has said, 2 meters distance. So they place these markers out on the floor, 2 meters here, 2 meters here, 2 meters here. And then you enter the room, and in one building, say on the 3rd floor of that building over there, it's perfectly all right. No one comes down infected. And then you go to that building across the road there, and 30 people are infected in a day. So their standardized solution, everyone should go back to work who can, is totally wrong. You need to know the environments in which the disease, or better said, the virus spreads most easily. And that means scientific analysis and health and safety analysis of those buildings. And it means the workers at least should be informed, should discuss, and they themselves should take control of the process, because it's their lives, their families' lives, and their neighborhood, their communities' lives that are at risk. And that's why the workers must have control over health and safety, informed by scientific evidence, informed by discussion, informed by debate. And that applies to the whole society. We have had no public debate. Zero. We've had these surreal world where the world's been turned upside down. We've all become computer numbers, communicating through Zoom and StreamYard and God knows what other technological mechanism. And do not, I mentioned earlier, back in March, I said, what on earth have Facebook and Google been doing? They know those people who are infected. They know it because people write to their friends. Oh, you write to your mum. Oh, I think I'm not very well today. I might be coming down. You communicate. Facebook, Google. Instead of helping to identify who's infected, to prevent the dissemination of the infections, Google and Facebook were hand in glove with the governments of each country, censoring the news, censoring information, and thereby fostering a belief within the population that everything is a lie. There were many people in Germany, for example, many people in Britain who now are weary. Well, is Bill Gates behind it? Because he's got vaccine. He supports these vaccine programs. Then there's the David Icke story. They banned Icke, so everyone wants to see what he's got to say. The Freemasons, it could be the Illuminati, the crocodiles. Multiple conspiracy theories flourish precisely because the government has been systematically lying to the population. So what's our choice but to look for information? And naturally, because we don't believe what the government's saying, which is correct not to believe it, naturally people then look up different ideas. And some ideas correspond perhaps, you know, you feared 5G. There are legitimate grounds for fearing 5G. Not, I believe, connected with Covid, but connected with the development of new technologies by capitalism to monitor, control and observe us. Not for our health, our welfare, our benefit, our happiness, our pleasure, but to observe and monitor, to rob us, plunder us during these 10 weeks. The most dramatic 10 weeks in most of our lives in many ways. During these 10 weeks, 60 million people in the world have been driven down to the edge of starvation. 60 million people. The total deaths from Covid, I don't know what the latest figure is, a couple of 100,000. So we've had this crisis of the healthcare system, which understandably and inevitably led to some kind of isolationism, led to the lockdowns in different countries. But simultaneously, what we've missed in observing what's happening is the global crisis of world capitalism. By that I mean this: a global crisis of a system of society that produces things for profit. Why did 40,000 officially die in Britain? Because making these things was a profit-based operation. Why did they say, don't wear masks in public? Or better said, don't wear masks. The public should not use surgical masks, they said. Why did they say that? Because they didn't have enough masks for the healthcare workers, for the patients, and the care workers, and the pensioners inside the care homes. And so what happened at the very beginning, because of the lackadaisical and laissez-faire pro-capitalist market attitude of the government, they calculated like this. They had two curves working. One curve, the infection curve and the death curve, and the curve that the health service can cope with. The other curve was the economic curve. As the economy turns down, the healthcare system would improve. But if the economy went up, the health and welfare of the people would decline. The disease would spread. More people would die. So capitalism gave us the choice. Health or capitalism. That's what it, profit or death. That's what they've given us the choice of. Now, how did it spread in Britain? People went to hospitals suffering from the disease. Patients took the disease to doctors and nurses because they didn't have the PPE. Doctors and nurses spread the disease to patients. They went back home. They sent them to the care homes. The care homes had no protection. They began to die. A third of all care homes, I believe it is, in Britain, have had spates of deaths in care homes. And so here is how the disaster took place. And I guarantee you this, some of you remember just down the road here, the Grenfell Tower. When the Grenfell Tower fire happened, everyone looking at the tower, I remember seeing the videos. People recorded, they would say, look, it's going up the cladding, it's going up the cladding, it's going up the cladding. And then everyone from the tower said, the cladding was put on for beautification and it was obviously dangerous. I went round from building to building where they had cladding put on by that same company. And I told the people in those buildings, and since that time, the government took down the cladding of those buildings. And yet, when the inquiry came, who was to blame? Who did they blame? The fire brigade were blamed for the deaths at Grenfell Tower. The fire brigade, the ones we cheered as heroes, the government, their experts, their judges, their independent inquiries concluded the fire brigade's responsible. Now I tell you this, the government organised for a woman who was called a yoga teacher to call for clap every Thursday. So many of you will have been out on Thursdays clapping away. This was an orchestrated campaign organised by Dominic Cummings. It was nothing to do with a yoga teacher. She's a PR agent. Look around London today, and there are sick, I don't mean sick as in the youth euphemism, good. I mean disgusting posters all around London. Okay, don't worry. All around London. And they have things like, summer is coming. Eine, mess, eine, happy, happy, I'm so happy. That was on the 1st of June. Those ones were posted around London, like psychedelic hippie posters from the 1960s. Then they have other posters with poems about the NHS. And other posters, community is strength. Each of these posters, to put them on the billboards, £1,000, £2,000, £3,000 a month, to put these posters on the wall, orchestrated by Dominic Cummings to make it seem that we are united together. If we were united together, I ask you this, whatever happened to the 750,000 volunteers? Where did they go to? What happened to them? How were they used? We were told last week that the government has ramped up, if I hear that word again, I'll vomit, ramped up the track and testing staff. 20,000 we have. You had 750,000 the week that they locked down, and you did nothing with them because the British government is incapable of combining the population in a community-based organisational force to protect the people. How many people had someone knock on their door and say, is everyone in the building fine? Are there people who are vulnerable here? Can we help you out? My friend Ishmael from Speaker's Corner, he was in Cuba when this broke out. He reported in Cuba. In the first week of the crisis in Cuba, 2 or 3 health officials and local nurses had knocked on their doors of every house. We had nothing. Right throughout the whole thing, we've had nothing but the ridiculous government press briefings. And now we're told we're gradually getting the economy back to work. But on what conditions? With 6.5 million furloughed,
with millions of self-employed with no income, or barely any income to speak of, with millions made unemployed. How are we going to make a society that is equitable after the crisis? That's why the explosion of Black Lives Matter has happened as well. Because the black population have suffered more in this crisis. Then why have they suffered more? Because they're the ones forced to go to work. They're the ones working in care homes. They're the ones who are the cleaners and caretakers. They're the ones working in the NHS. That's why they're more likely to die above all else. Because they're the ones whose economic circumstances compel them into bad conditions. They're also more likely to live in tower blocks. Therefore, to use lifts. Using lifts which other people are in, where people cough and spit and so on. And therefore, the chance of transmission is greater. Just the same as in a tower block, so it's like in a cruise ship. The difference between that and the cottage in Durham, where Dominic Cummings decides to drive to when he's sick. The difference between that and a tower block in Elephant Castle is palpably obvious. And yet no special measures in architecture and in analysis of architecture of dissemination has been taken. They haven't advised us that tower blocks are more dangerous than castles. They haven't advised us that living in a caravan in the middle of nowhere is safer than living in a place where you have to go to work by tube. Well, I mean, now they've said if you can, take a private car. Otherwise, cycle. Otherwise, cycle, that's what they say. Now, I pointed out a number of slogans here. I'll just run through why I've said those slogans. This is the intersection between these two elements. Black Lives Matter is not about racism in and of itself. Racism is integrated with the system of capitalism. The origin of capitalism, of the advanced capitalist countries, is Europe. The origin of the United States is slave trade and European colonizers. The origin of modern Latin America is the slave trade and colonization and imperialism. The origin of modern Africa, or better said, the lack of modern Africa, to the degree that it's backward, is caused by imperialist occupation. They sliced the continent up like a melon. The origin of China's crisis and also its revolution is because the British forced the Indians to produce opium to sell to the Chinese. And when the Chinese refused, they seized Hong Kong and bombed China. And now these idiots, who only a few months ago swore they're taking control of our borders, our money, our land, now they say, don't protest about George Floyd, but invite and don't let all these immigrants from Europe work here, but welcome in 3 million Hong Kongers. Because in Hong Kong, you've had protests for a year, smashing up the tube stations, smashing up the public transportation, smashing up banks and buildings, willy-nilly, backed, financed and organised by America and supported by Britain. So these crooks, suddenly they condemn the violence by protesters in Britain and America, but they welcome the violence in Hong Kong. The other thing they've done is this. There are many things they've done, but the other thing they've done on the whole China thing is to spread this lie that the virus was made in a laboratory, that there was some sort of conspiracy, that the Chinese have hidden things. And that's why we've got so many deaths. Blame the Chinese. That's what, of course, Chinese, I'm half Chinese myself, but you won't see it. But if you see Chinese people walking around, they're worried because people shout at them. People say you're bat eaters. They eat bats in China in restaurants. They do not eat bats in China in restaurants. If you look up bats restaurant on Google, you'll find a case. You will find a case. And the case is of a vegetarian woman in Florida, the United States, eating bats at a restaurant, smoky bat. She eats it. And she reports, I'm a vegetarian, but I've given up vegetarianism for the day to taste bat. So, you won't find a single menu of any restaurant in China, backwards in time over the last 10 years, that serves a bat. None. Then they say the bat, well, the Chinese wet market. They had wet markets. You go down Harrow Road and you go to the fishmongers. The fishmongers is a wet market. That's how, if you go to the Rambla in Barcelona, off the Rambla there's a big marketplace. That's a wet market. Wet market means they wash it down. That's all it means. It doesn't mean you've got pangolins, although some places. It's true, I've been in China in the early 1990s and even up until about 2000. In Guangzhou, for example, they did used to have wild animal markets. True, they did. They were closed down. They were closed down by about 2005. But in some places they will pop up again, because some peasants living in the countryside, trying to earn some money, will grab these and sell. And some rich people think, you know, gives them a hard-on or something like that, if they eat some types of animals. Nevertheless, this originates from bats. Many places you can come in contact with bats. People who go caving. In Yunnan province, some people are doing inspecting, analysing bats. Just why do bats have these viruses? It's a peculiarity of the species. Bats are the only flying mammals. The only flying mammals. And because of that, for some reason, I believe it's something to do with their metabolism of being able to fly, allows them to host viruses which do not kill them. And so they host hundreds of viruses that can infect other people, or other creatures, in particular human beings. But many other diseases come from animals, or even from plants. Smallpox, chicken pox, MERS comes from camels, SARS came from bats. And people who investigated these bats in Yunnan province, some of them came down sick with various viruses. So you do not require, and there's no evidence for a laboratory release of the virus. And yet the American government and the British government have been piling in the lies to say this is caused by the Chinese. The Chinese didn't inform us. The Chinese lied to us. We had 2 months after China locked down to prepare actions to protect the people in Britain, yet 40,000 dead. The Chinese had no prior knowledge from the beginning of December, when the first cases appeared, until the 23rd of January when they locked down. They bought us time. Not only did they buy us time, they've sent ventilators, masks, medical staff, advisors to the whole of the world where people wanted it. Even Britain has received support from the Chinese. Plane loads of goods arriving to protect the British people. And yet they're attacked, because we know that underlying this crisis, concealed behind the crisis, is the global collapse of capitalism, and therefore a conflict in trade, a conflict between nations over who controls the world when the virus is over. This is developing, and there is real danger of conflict and war as a consequence of this. Once you get subconsciously in people's minds that the Chinese are to blame for the virus, for the deaths, it ticks away in people's brains. And some people, you know, in a world like we live in today, schizophrenia, madness, psychosis is going to explode. Of course it will. And the consequence of that will be insipid thoughts entering people's minds subconsciously, promoted by this narrative from the government, trying to conceal their responsibility for the deaths. And then they say, well, when the Hong Kong protest is repressed, they will scream and shout about Hong Kong, ramp up the hostilities with the Chinese. And yet, when they repress demonstrations, when they repress the people, they then say, oh, we're protecting democracy. Not only that, but on the black issue, the same thing. They're going to do the same thing with Black Lives Matter. In a few weeks' time, that's why the narrative now is this: Priti Patel, don't go on a demonstration. Don't go out on demonstrations, she says. Why? Because in a few weeks' time, she wants to say, it's not Dominic Cummings who broke the lockdown. And I'll be quite clear, as far as I can see, since June the 1st, there's no lockdown at all anymore. Exactly. It's finished. It's finished. People are walking up to people they've not seen for a while, start hugging them, meet up with them. People are ignoring it. And how can you expect them to do anything else? Every time they flip-flop from one madness to another. At the beginning they said, you can go to the park. In fact, Boris Johnson said the royal park, no sorry, not the royal parks, the national parks are open to everybody for free. Go there. And then they had drones following people in the Yorkshire Dales. 2 people in the middle of nowhere, and the police were sending drones to watch them. In Hyde Park, I came down here, police were wandering around the megaphones. Go home now, go home now. The police, no masks themselves, no protection themselves. In fact, a couple of them came up to us a couple of weeks ago, about 10 of them in the van. They said, you're not social distancing. I said, neither are you. He turns around and says, we're exempt. We're exempt. We're exempt from the virus? Or we're exempt? How many times have they been tested? It's no good testing someone once. Disease can be infected at any time. So they have to constantly test these key workers, constantly test the staff. And the next thing they need to do is serological tests. But of course, everything is bananas in Britain. Don't you remember weeks ago, before Boris Johnson was in hospital and nearly died? Great moral, a great guiding light as to how we should behave to protect ourselves, the British government. Chris Whitty, Dominic Cummings, Matt Hancock, what's he called? Prince Philip, and Boris Johnson all came down with the virus. Yet they told us that we need to listen to them how to avoid it. I mean, how ridiculous can you get? How absurd and bizarre. The only Prime Minister in the world who got the virus. And yet they're still cocky enough and arrogant enough and self-assured of their own bullshit enough that they think they can turn around to us and hoodwink us with their bullshit. In the parky, they said, don't go to the park, don't hang out in the park, don't sit on the grass. In fact, now then afterwards they turn around and say, go to the park, sit on the grass. Then people go to the park, sit on the grass. They go to the seaside, sit by the beach. And then they say, look how many people there are on the beach. They close the toilets. Then they say, look, people are shitting everywhere. What's this about? You know, what sort of madness is this? And yet, you know, when they're interviewed, the journalists, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it? The journalists were so fixated on Brexit that they had nothing else in their tiny brains. You know how everyone kind of lost track of the in-depth knowledge that all these great journalists had about Brexit. Every single twist and turn, every single linguistic mistake or correction, everything they knew about it, you know. And there were a few people in society who I knew, who knew also all that stuff. But most people, they were completely lost. They either supported Brexit or opposed it. They weren't going to change their mind. And yet, when it came to a real crisis, with thousands and tens of thousands of people going to die, the journalists were totally and absolutely impotent. They had nothing to say. They had no serious questions. They didn't challenge the government. They didn't challenge the advisors. When someone said science, they wet their pants and, oh, it's the science, is it? What bloody science? They still haven't published the so-called scientific information guiding them. And yet anyone in the world can look up on Google Scholar and find scientific paper after scientific paper after scientific paper, thousands of them from all around the world on all the key questions we wanted to know about. They were already published. And yet the British government, it's all secret. And the great trick is this. They say, well, if you've got a difficult question from a journalist, the answer of Matt Hancock, Chris Whitty, Dominic Raab and all the rest of them is, well, there'll be plenty of time for an inquiry at the end. And I guarantee you, the inquiry, unless we're very careful, the inquiry will conclude the NHS was to blame. It will say that. Just as the fire brigade was to blame for Grenfell Tower, they will say the NHS is to blame. And there will be a logic to it. The logic will be this. Most people who died were infected in hospitals, brought it into hospitals, or transmitted it from hospitals. And therefore, hospital administration will be blamed. And they'll find a few cases where there have been mistakes, the emails sent here and there. Someone said, we need PPE now. Some manager cocked it up, and 30 cases happened, and they spread to 3,000. And therefore, they'll say, the NHS was to blame. And then all of us, the public, who felt so marvellous about the NHS, will be let down. After all, wasn't the NHS all Corbyn's plan? Wasn't that all about the mad lefties going on about the NHS? We've got other things we need to think about. The economy. We urgently need chlorinated chicken to cure the people, to purge the insides of people of the viruses, you know. Inject some chlorine into your lungs and you'll soon cure yourself. No. But the world has been turned upside down. And the Black Lives Matter demonstration, or demonstrations, is an illustration of the dynamics we are about to witness. It is the first shot of a worldwide movement of the masses, of the lower castes in India, of the workers, the migrant workers, forced to walk hundreds of miles by this criminal government of the Indian government, the South African government, which does not provide the people decades after apartheid was ended, does not provide the people in Soweto, in the townships, with water or soap. And then they turn around and say, don't drink alcohol, don't smoke cigarettes. That's what they say, you know, as an excuse to cover up for their own failings. In America, 40 million unemployed. In South America, millions and millions unemployed. Millions will be driven to starvation. The foundation for challenging the social system we live under is emerging now. And by challenging, I mean a revolutionary change in society. I return to a couple of slogans here to finish up. End homelessness forever. Don't forget this. One of the few things that at the beginning was good was that the homeless, I went round central London about 25th of March. And the homeless were being, I found one woman on the street in Wardour Street. I said, have you got anywhere to stay? And she said, yeah, they're housing me tonight. And I used to live in Soho. I used to see all the homeless people all around. Most of those people, there were large numbers of those people, recognizable faces. Most of them were housed. But then you see migrant workers living in London inside a landlord's house. The landlord's out, you go. And they ended up on the streets. And now you look around London again, the homeless are returning. No, we do not accept that homelessness should return. When so many empty buildings all around London sit empty. Thousands and thousands, millions of square meters of empty property sitting here. Homeless people back on the street. So end homelessness here and around the world. No. Here we have workers, not employers. Who should we protect? Who are the ones who need to be protected in this world? It is the working classes. It has been shown during this crisis that the workers are central to the operation of society. The healthcare workers, transport workers, delivery workers, food producers, all these things. The whole society has functioned for 10 weeks with them and them alone. So it shows you how much superficiality there is in this world. You can have millions. One of the things they did was last week they said, now you can open your estate agents again. What the hell do we need estate agents for? We've got internet. Landlord lists their property. Tenant registers to visit. Why do you need the estate agent? Parasitic rentiers grabbing money here and there. That's how the world runs these days. Rentiers, capitalists, grabbing money from money, robbing the world with impunity. You know, companies, there was a case only a couple of days ago. I can't remember the name of the company, I'm very sorry. They announced, we're working on a vaccine, we're going to study on a vaccine. I think it was 8 cases. Suddenly, they announced this. At a corporate event, they announced it. Share prices went up. Money was made. Money was made by crooks off our backs without actually having any evidence that the inoculation they're offering works. This is the madness we live in. All these companies, Boris Johnson was on telly, was it yesterday, day before, chairing a meeting on international vaccine consortium. And he keeps saying, oh, the British are investing more than anybody else in vaccines. First question we need to ask is, who will own the vaccine? The vaccine must be public property, not the property of private companies, public property, to ensure it's safe, to ensure it's free, to ensure it's available. We must serve the needs of the world's population. Now, next point here. 24-hour working week. Well, if I would have said that to you 5 months ago, 4 months ago, you would have said the guy's nuts. 24-hour working week would be the means to get back to work for everybody, so no unemployment. Instead of this, we're going to have 3, 4. The police officer in the park, he was going, he said 6 million, I don't know, 3 or 4 million unemployed. So share the work out. Let everybody participate. Guarantee higher wages for the workers and cap the wages for the wealthiest. That's what, then people come on the demonstration. Black Lives Matter. They say we're sick of inequality. Because the inequality means that the black population and migrant populations are lowest on the food chain under capitalism. I used to work on the buses. When you got an early shift starting at 4 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the morning, only black people get on the bus. Do they like to get up early? No. It's because the shittiest jobs they're offered are those that are in the early mornings, cleaning offices for the wealthy. And so you need to transform the balance of power. Share the work out in society. And then there are people like my friend here. He's very concerned about the environment. What happened? One positive thing that happened during the shutdown. The animals and birds returned. Central London was full of... I had a pheasant in my garden in Ladbroke Grove. Unfortunately, it was eaten by a fox. But nevertheless, you had all... And the birds are flying right on your next to you. They're not bothered anymore. There was a cartoon even of some, you know, a zoo, like 2019, people looking at animals in the zoo. 2020, animals looking at us at home, stuck indoors. There was truth to that. And there has been, no doubt about it, because many people point, I'm not so sure about it myself, but carbon dioxide, they say, there's been a massive decline. There's been a greening of the earth in the last 10 weeks. So if you want to really deal with that question in that way, you can. By reorganizing the economy to serve the needs of those who work it. Not those who are worked by it, not those exploited by it, not those plundered by it, not those robbed by it, by the landlords, the capitalists and the bankers. But the workers who make the wealth must control the direction which society takes. This is the world we're talking about. We know now we're dealing with the whole world, not one country, not isolated from each other, the whole world. Every country. By the way, when the British government when they talked about the airplanes, we're going to control, we're going to quarantine for 14 days anyone who comes into Britain. Now they say this, quarantine when they come in. But don't forget this, if you wanted to track and trace the spread of the disease across the world. I guarantee you one of the central vectors of transmission of the disease to South Africa, to Nigeria, to South America, to the rest of Africa, to India, was Britain. Britain acted as the agency to transmit the disease across the entire world, uncontrolled. And for that, the British must also pay. Not the Chinese, the British must pay. So, next point here, as I run through towards the end. Workers' control of safety, I've mentioned that earlier on. Each workplace is a different environment. The workers must be informed, have adequate knowledge, discuss the issues, and take action themselves. And if the employers don't agree, go on strike. Work to rule. Because it's your life, your parents' lives, your family, your community's lives. They banned the Notting Hill Carnival. They said you can't have a Notting Hill Carnival. And I heard people where I am, in Ladbroke Grove, moaning about this. They're saying, it's all right, Cheltenham Festival, we can't have Notting Hill Carnival. So what do? We organise from our own to put up some music outside your house. Have a London-wide carnival while we're free. Let us communicate with each other, discuss with each other, discover, question, analyse, understand, accumulate knowledge. Because we need to be armoured, strong, powerful, combined together to be able to break the power of those who've created this catastrophe in Britain and on a world scale. Now, so publish scientific advice, let the people decide. This again has been a criminal action. We have not had the information informing government decisions. So of course nobody could question whether they were right or wrong. And the government said, one day you'll find out. And so that'll just be for journalists to debate and discuss with themselves in the newspapers for a couple of years. While the rest of us are concerned with what happens here and now, and what has happened over the last weeks. Now, defend the right to question, speak and demonstrate. I'll deal with that one and then the next one. For weeks we were told we're not allowed to speak here. This is the first Speaker's Corner, real Speaker's Corner since March. Unless you have the right to criticise, the right to question, the right to debate, then we're just pawns for the administration. Then it is an Orwellian dictatorship, which many people will warn. Look at the government rules, the regulations. They're creating a dictatorship. Well, it is if we allow it to be. It's not if we mobilise, organise and defend our rights. The right to speak, the right to demonstrate, the right to question, the right to challenge, the right to protest, and yes, the right to bring down governments that engage in mass murder. In reality is what they do. Mass murder. Engels used to use the word social murder. They didn't personally intend to kill any individual, but their policies automatically led to mass murder. The final point, no war against China. I guarantee you over the next months, as the crisis, if it declines in Britain, I'm not sure it will, but if it declines in Britain, again they'll go back over China, China, China. Rupert Murdoch is running a special campaign from Australia Sky News to constantly lie about China and beat the drums of war. And Hong Kong will be one angle, Taiwan another angle, and then, you know, they just go on and on and on about China. We have no conflict with China. The Chinese people protected their people and protected the world. Our government's messed up, not China. So I say, and by the way, don't forget this, South America, by the way, in Venezuela, in the middle of the crisis, the Americans sent in Marines to try and overthrow the government and kill Maduro. That's how mad these people are. In the middle of a desperate health crisis across the world, the first thing on the mind of Donald Trump is overthrow Maduro in Venezuela. That's how mad these people are. Therefore, we need to get some sense of sanity back into the world, to reconquer our knowledge, to rebuild our collectivity. Having been in de facto solitary or near solitary confinement, on and off for 10 weeks, we come out of that awakened, aware, conscious, able to act, willing to act, and as the young people have shown, not afraid of those in power who claim authority they don't deserve. We need transformation. We need organisation. We need mobilisation. We need revolutionary change in society from top to bottom and the end of the rule of capitalist power. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Not bad, you?
Coping all right with this?
I'm fine, yeah.
Good man. Yes,
You?
Content over everything. Content over everything. From your Berlin.
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Listen. COE. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. I don't even listen to Sky TV. I just listen to COE. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. I don't even listen to Sky Man, just listen to COE. Man, just listen to COE. Man, just listen to COE. If you see me in COE, control over everything. COE.
Man, not even know BBC. Man, not even know ITV. Not even listen to the MUM. They don't listen to COE.
South Korea, are there any black people in South Korea?
Listen to your mum, listen to your mum.
What? There are black Christians being slaughtered every week across Africa. Look at what China is doing to Muslims. You don't often hear me talking about that, do you?
Hey. Like I'm sharing the space in my head with a phantom. Make me want to throw lead in my magnum. Aim at a cock, empty my mag.
Rather unpleasant man. Give it rather disgusting death.
Like I'm sharing the space in my head with a phantom. Make me want to throw lead in my magnum. Aim at a cock, empty my cannon, but I blow me some pot.
It's
Empty my
people
dragon.
who don't want Trump to win another election,
Peaceful
for
solution.
example. It's people that don't like Boris Johnson. It's people that don't like Brexit. Why else is it? Why would the death of one criminal result in riots? Why?